Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'm going to be discussing the main points regarding the long-awaited budget statement which was intended to fix the mess Truss and Kwarteng made. In this video I'll look at why the government say the budget is needed, because that's crucial, why it's really needed, because that's also crucial, what are some of the more important features of it, and basically what did Labour fire back with. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So the first point to make is that the budget obviously contained public spending cuts and tax rises. This was not a surprise because the Chancellor had already said this would happen. Now, neither tax rises nor spending restrictions are popular in themselves. So politically, the government had to convince people that it was necessary. People will accept things if they're necessary, because what you're going to do. So why did they say it was necessary? Well, they claim there's a hole in the budget. A deficit, to use a more technical term, a difference between what the Treasury has coming in and what the government planned to spend. Now, before I get on to how that's nonsense, if we accept that the deficit is real, which it isn't, but the public will believe it is, so we have to behave as if it is, then we have to ask whose fault it is. Basically, it's the Conservatives' fault. And that's not even a matter for debate after this week, officially, formally. Earlier this week, Labour presented a motion to Parliament to censure Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng for making an arse of things, and to call for them to have at least £6,000 deducted from their ministerial severance payments. The motion passed unopposed. That meant there wasn't even a vote, because not a single MP raised any objections, so it wasn't forcing a vote. Now, the financial penalty is neither here nor there. We don't even know if Truss or Kwarteng will accept any of their ministerial severance pay. They might not. The point wasn't about that. The point is that there is now a formal record that the House of Commons, all MPs, consider Truss and Kwarteng to be responsible for the current financial mess. That this budget statement, though it will also reflect other issues, is being made in order to address the serious economic mismanagement of the previous Tory Prime Minister and Chancellor. So when it comes to blame, there is a formal record that not a single MP objects to that blame being laid at the feet of Truss and Kwarteng. In fact, even Truss and Kwarteng didn't object. As for the deficit itself, as economists and economic journals have been making clear for quite some time, it's a political device more than an economic one. The deficit is not a deficit as we would consider it with household expenditure, because we only have limited control over household income, therefore a deficit can be real for us. You know, for the government, it's a product of their fiscal rules. They could change the rules and they could make that deficit larger, but that would be mad. They could make it smaller. Well, that's helpful. They could make it go away completely. Oh, well, let's do that. Oh, but wait, they don't want to do that. Hunt did announce changes to the fiscal rules. He said that underlying debt had to fall as a proportion of GDP at the end of a 5-year rolling period. Previously, it was 3. That makes the deficit way smaller, because it means you've basically got 5 years to sort yourself out. Second, that public sector borrowing over the same period must be below 3% of GDP. Now, it was already capped at 3%, so I assume the change means, again, changing it from a 3-year period to a 5-year period. But these changes to the fiscal rules, which are arbitrary, you know, he said 5 years, could have made it 6, could have made it 4. He just made it up. They'll have reduced that deficit. So as economists keep pointing out, how large the deficit is more a question of politics than economics. I mean, you could take the view, as indeed Keynesian economics will tell you to take the view, manage a deficit, but don't worry that you have one during times of recession. Spend to make sure you can maintain your national infrastructure during times of economic upheaval, and then sort it out in the good times when you've got your economy growing again. You know, that there is even a deficit to worry about is because the government have chosen to have one to worry about. But after changing the fiscal rules to reduce but not eliminate the deficit, which he could have chosen to do, Hunt then had to announce his tax and spend plans to address the problems that he has fabricated. Not that this is to say there is no problem for them to deal with. There is a problem, and there is a problem this budget very genuinely had to deal with. But the problem was not the deficit. The problem is confidence in the government. Confidence from investors that the government can handle the economy. That is the problem to be addressed. The deficit is fictional. Hunt announced high rates of borrowing, very high rates of borrowing. Necessary, but still. But he introduced rules that mean the borrowing has to come down sharply in a few years. You think, hang on a minute. In a couple of years, we're probably going to have a Labour government. Yes, exactly. Jeremy Hunt, the gentleman that he is, has very kindly said he's come up with a plan that will allow the Tories to borrow heavily right up until the next election, and then expect the government that forms after it to tighten their borrowing up. A bit like having a plan to trash your hotel room, but promise the management that the guests who follow you will clean and tidy it all up. And if Labour decide, bugger that, we need to get some investment going, the Tories will whine like spoiled brats that they're not behaving responsibly. We aren't following the rules. In terms of headline announcements, you know, the one that's going to affect most people, so be of the most public interest, the tax rate, the top rate of tax band is being brought down from 150,000 to 125,000 a year. So more people will pay the top rate of tax, although that's not going to be most people. But that rate still remains at 45%. There was talk of it going to 50%. All other income tax and national insurance bans are going to be frozen for a further 2 years, which is a tax rise for everyone, because the government had planned to lower those taxes next year. Also, even if you're on very low incomes, it's a hefty tax rise because the allowance isn't going to go up. So that's frozen as well. So it's actually a very hefty tax rise for those on the lowest incomes. There were also cuts to dividend allowances, but that impacts fewer people, of course. But it is still representing a tax increase to those who do receive them. So that's taxing the people who may be struggling with the cost of living already without these extra tax rises. What about those who are making out like bandits? I am thinking particularly of the large oil and energy companies with their huge windfall profits. I remind people that yesterday it was announced SSE, an energy company, had trebled its profits. Well, Hunt says windfall taxes will be levied and they will raise 14 billion, with some of that coming from low carbon sources of energy. So let's wait for the details, because the last time Rishi Sunak announced a windfall tax, it turned out not to be one. But this sounds to me like another fiddle to make it sound like they're applying a windfall tax. But it will magically mean that somehow, don't know how, the likes of Shell don't actually pay anything at all. Also, why so little in general? Could easily raise much more than 14 billion, way more. In fact, it could easily fill their stated deficit on its own. Although they don't have to, there are other reasonable sources of revenue to deal with it as well. In fact, the windfall taxes aren't actually going to contribute anything to the deficit. Although Hunt says it'll raise 14 billion, that's not 14 billion for their deficit. Because Hunt then announced tax breaks for businesses worth the same 14 billion. So he's going to tax some businesses and give tax breaks to other businesses for exactly the same amount. Now, if everything else was fine, I've got no issue with that. You know, because what you could argue is it's a way of taxing larger businesses more to help smaller ones. Okay, great. We derive a lot of benefit from small businesses being supported. And when you've got economically tough times, they do suffer. But the point of this budget was to fill what they think is a hole. And not a penny of windfall tax is going to be used to do this. In other words, the cost of Truss and Kwarteng's blunder is going to come entirely, as far as I could tell from his speech, entirely from ordinary working families in the form of higher taxes and poorer public services. And of course, the poorer public services, as well as the higher tax on ordinary people, hurts the economy because those on lower incomes spend more of their disposable income. So they won't be able to afford as much now. So that hurts businesses. And public services are our essential infrastructure. They're not just there so that we can have a nicer life. They're there so our businesses can flourish. When Hunt had finished and sat down, the attention was then obviously on Labour's Rachel Reeves. The political game here is for Hunt and Sunak to claim that they are being responsible with this budget and that there's no even if they have to accept that people will realise it's a Tory blunder they're fixing, they want people to at least think that they are at least fixing it and there is no alternative that eases the pain for ordinary workers. For Labour, the game is about not only showing that this mess is the fault of the Tories, not letting them get away with that, but that the pain they're inflicting is a political choice. And I would say the particular challenge for Labour, not just Reeves this afternoon, I'm not sure how much that will have happened, but for Labour in general, is to make these points, but also they need to make those points to get the public on board with Labour, but also to point out areas of the budget that would make even Tory MPs uncomfortable defending, which means Tory voters would not be happy. I thought she did quite well in all three regards, but Labour have still got the work to do over the next couple of days. We're going to have to wait for polling from this weekend and beyond to see the impact on public opinion. But Reeves immediately threw the gauntlet down by saying, and I wish they would do this more. I don't think they do this enough, Labour. You know, she said, never mind COVID and Russia, basically. The UK has grown by an average of 1.4% under the Conservatives compared to 2.1% under Labour in the years before. So basically, and I wish you'd have emphasised this point, Labour gave you 50% more growth. And it's now a comparable period of time. The Tories have been in power for about half a year shy of where Labour were in power. So it's a comparable length of time now. She also pointed out that we're the only G7 country that is poorer than before the pandemic. She described the Tory economic management as a doom loop. You know, she did really well, I thought, in not only pointing out how the Tories were responsible for where we are now, but that their so-called solutions will only hurt the economy more. What Labour, as I say, need to do over the next couple of days is make sure they get their messages out, which not only keeps the focus on how the blame for this budget is the Tories, but also that Labour have an alternative that will not sacrifice our national infrastructure or force working people to pay while the ultra-wealthy get away without taking responsibility. Basically, they need to do now what they did with the energy bill, where that worked for them. Their energy plan worked, got the public on side. They need to do the same thing now. But there's bound to be more on this as the detail is scrutinised. I mean, this is just the opening salvo. This is huge. It's going to be big over the next few weeks. There might even be some fun and games when the vote takes place. I don't know when the vote is going to take place. It doesn't have to for a while. But it might be interesting to see if any rebellions against Sunak are forming, or if they'll keep their powder dry a little longer. It may depend on the reaction, you know, because it's not just about the public polls. Because this, as I say, this budget had nothing at all to do with the imagined deficit. The real reason for this budget was about repairing investor confidence. On the evidence so far, it doesn't look like the markets were that impressed with the statement. So I imagine we're going to have to wait for early next week to really see the full picture, the considered views for investors. But if they don't look good, then the Tories are in a real hole, because, as I say, they can talk about the deficit all they like. Everyone knows, or everyone in the know knows, that what the government were having to do with this budget today was repair investor confidence. But all of that, of course, is up for discussion over the next few days and even weeks. What is not up for discussion is that the Chancellor has announced today that real terms disposable household income is set to fall by the largest amount since records began nearly 70 years ago. And that the following year will be the second worst. After that, people will have a chance to vote for a different government. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.